Right, good morning, everyone. We'll resume the hearing of submissions for hearing number 30.4, which is rezoning requests for Lincoln. And just before we hear from our first submitter this morning, anything for us from the 42A reporting team? No, thank you. All right, so the next, the first submitter on our list is Next Level Developments Limited. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you. Now, I did lodge some legal submissions. They're fairly short because they're largely a repetition of some legal submissions that I'll give shortly for the Carter Group. The 2 points I did want to make, obviously, is that one distinguishing feature of this particular site is that it's already zoned industrial, effectively. So this is an industrial to residential shift, and what that does is put this land outside being caught by the MPS HPL because it is not rural land. And the other piece, and we will obviously talk about this as we hear from the witnesses, is the fairly sort of unusual situation we end up in, depending on whether other rezoning requests land, and in particular the decision on PC 69 is that we end up with an industrially zoned piece of land which is surrounded effectively by residential. So that's quite a key feature. The other matter that you might have wondered about is why we have some evidence being given by Arvida. The sequence of events is that since the submission seeking rezoning was originally lodged by Next Level, Arvida have purchased the land. So Mr. McGibbon is here from Arvida, but that's why that evidence came in as rebuttal rather than up the front. So those are probably the three key matters I wanted to draw to your attention. I won't deal with the content of the legal submissions now unless you've got any questions, because it's largely a repetition of what I'll do when Carter Group come shortly.
All right, well, I'll just see if we do have any questions. Andrew?
No questions from me, thank you.
Aaron? And Malcolm?
No, none from me.
Thank you.
No questions from me either, not in terms of substance, but just for my clarification, and I may have forgotten, it's probably in the evidence somewhere. Has Next Level submitted on variation 1 as well?
Yes, okay. We have. But you will have heard my submissions that I gave for the Carter Group at Rolleston that I have some misgivings about the scope.
Yeah.
The PC 69 land is obviously in the variation, but the Next Level land is not. So this is their primary hearing, as they would see it, to get themselves rezoned from industrial to residential, putting aside MDRS, which I say could be dealt with in another process later down the track if that was needed. The shift from industrial to rural industrial to residential we see being determined on the evidence that you have in front of you at this hearing.
Yeah, thank you. And in that regard, what we will be doing as a panel is considering the evidence before us, and we'll be coming to a finding on whether or not residential zoning is appropriate for the site. And then as we hear from the independent hearing panel further down the track, I guess if we were in favour, if this panel was in favour of a residential zoning, then once the IHP panel has made its decision, there'd be a landing on what type of residential zoning that might be. But certainly in terms of this panel, we'll be making a finding on whether or not we think residential zoning, without going into the specifics of the type of the zoning, is appropriate or not.
Thank you, sir. That's my understanding.
But trouble for you is you won't see that until it comes out at the same time.
Which is exactly why we're here, and we're not putting all our eggs in that later basket.
Yeah. So. All right, so I just wanted to clarify that for you, but other than that, no further questions, but I did find your legal submissions to be a helpful and concise summary of the case, so thank you for that.
Thank you. So I thought probably in terms of order, although he came last, it might be best for him to come first, and we would hear from Mr. McGibbon first. Now, he's only lodged rebuttal, so I was really going to get him just to introduce himself and then answer any questions that the panel have in relation to that rebuttal. So you just
that's fine.
For sure. So you just introduce yourself, explain what your role is, and answer any questions.
My name is Ben McGibbon, Development Manager in the South Island team for Arvida, Retirement Village business. So if you have any queries, please I'll answer as best as I can.
Any queries from Mr. McGibbon?
No, just thank you for your evidence. It was very useful for for background. Thank you. No questions.
Raymond? And Malcolm? Mr. McGivern, I also found your evidence very helpful. Just what I'm interested in finding out from you, if you can tell us at this stage, is what your development timetable might look like. And I know we're in a hearing now considering the zoning. I understand you've taken some initial construction design work. I'm not sure if you've done anything on the ground yet, but can you give us a rough idea going forward in terms of
Sure.
years, what your timeframe is looking like?
Yes, look,
Should you get a successful zoning change, let's assume that as a starting point, just take us forward
Yes.
from there.
look, it would be our intention to commence resource consent and master planning documentation in advance of that as soon as we're comfortable that an appropriate rezone is achieved, and we would not hesitate to progress construction and early works activities as early as is possible. Being a publicly listed company, we have the funding available, and we have a pipeline of projects and funding available for those pipeline of which the Lincoln retirement village is allocated for.
So if we were assume, for instance, that decisions from this panel and the independent hearing panel considering variation one, don't worry about the details of that, but say decisions were released mid-year, what would the time frame look like going forward from that?
It might take us 3 to 4 months to pull together a resource consent, and then there would be the consenting period, in which time we would be getting ready to start on site almost immediately. We've been in discussions with Next Level Development for close to 2 years now, so we know the property well, we know the market, so we would not hesitate in progressing site activities straight away.
Right. So the consenting might take 3 to 6 months, or then you'd start building thereafter. So
very much we'd start the early works activities, and then we would be lodging for depending on how we lodge that first master plan. It might be on a stage by stage basis, or for the full master plan.
Okay.
Just to prompt you, you said you know the market. Can you describe the market for retirement and aged care in Lincoln? What your understanding of it is, the demand?
Yes, it really is. There's a gap in the market in Lincoln as such, and the market research that we've undertaken certainly supports the need for in the future, in the coming few years, for the need for a retirement village of a nature of ours. That's really the essentials, fundamentals, and we think that it's a fantastic location to that part of Lincoln. We acknowledge it is currently zone industrial, and but it really, the way that it is surrounded by very good quality residential developments, Te Whāriki, Vidiko Park, and possibly Plan Change 69, we think it will be a fantastic fit for that part of town. We've got a great catchment area for the whole of the rural catchment throughout the Selwyn rural area, and also right into Banks Peninsula. There's not a great deal of retirement activity happening there, and so it's a great location.
And just to keep drilling a bit further into the time frame, so if middle of the year you start your consenting master planning process, realistically, when might you see the first units being available for use?
I would say that usually the first stage takes about 12 to 14 months, and then at stage by stage basis, it'll take it'll lessen up. It'll go 10 to 12 months for the following stages.
Yeah. Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. I might get you to swap out, and I'll get Dave up under. Now, next we have Mr. Compton Moen on urban form and landscaping, who's also provided some rebuttal evidence. I would just signal to the panel that Mr. Compton Moen is also giving evidence shortly in the Carter Group, PC 69, matter. And obviously you might want to ask him some questions about the interface between the two. So he will be coming back shortly if you've got some more questions, but don't be too confined into what you ask him now.
Microphone. Morning and welcome. Thanks for the evidence which you've read. You obviously appeared before us before. You're very welcome to highlight key points for us, or else we can go straight to questions. Up to you.
I just highlight that we've just made one minor change to the ODP, providing a cycle link through from the southwest corner through to the northeast corner. But largely, as I've outlined in my report, most of the changes from industrial to residential are positive. It reduces any edge conflict that potentially may happen between the two different zones. So yes, I'm open to questions.
All right, thank you for that. Andrew.
I thought the evidence was clear, so I have no questions. Thank you.
Just a couple of questions from me. So looking at the outline development plan attached to your rebuttal evidence, and so the change you mentioned at the start, is that indicated on that one? Or is that a change to that plan?
No, it's indicated on the one on my rebuttal.
Okay, thank you. And so just in terms of that outline development plan, we've heard that Arvida has purchased a site, desires to build a retirement village. So does the outline development plan cater for that?
Yes, it would. It would have to be a most retirement villages have a degree of permeability, not as much as a typical subdivision. But that's an aspect that could be dealt with in detailed design at a later stage.
Yep, and forgive me for this next question if I've just missed it in the evidence. So we have to your rebuttal a plan, an actual diagram plan. Most outline development plans have an accompanying narrative. Is that somewhere else in the evidence?
I'd pass that question over to the planner who so really for this was just looking at the graphic side of it and that spatial arrangement.
Well,
You help with that question. So the narrative.
Matt, do you want to answer that question, the narrative around the ODP?
Well, I guess the narrative around the ODP is that we didn't really seek any changes to the current plan provisions that were proposed. We were seeking nothing specific in terms of this ODP.
Yeah.
More just a plan from Mr. Compton Mine, just to set out, I guess, the critical key links to the adjoining blocks and parcels.
Okay, so in terms of the evidence before us, then there's the plan, the diagram, but no accompanying ODP narrative.
No accompanying specific narrative. No.
Okay.
Just what's been provided in the proposed district plan and around the general residential zone.
Yeah. All right, thank you. No further questions.
Right, thank you. Cracking through it. No. Fuller. Now from Mr. Fuller, you should have evidence and rebuttal evidence.
Yes, good morning and welcome, Mr. Fuller. Thank you very much for the evidence and the rebuttal. We've read that, so it's up to you. You can either take that as read, or if you wish to summarise any matters or highlight any matters for us, you're very welcome to.
I think I'm happy to take that as read. I suppose the only comments I would make is in my rebuttal evidence, I really focused on the idea of a residential development at the site, whereas we've heard this morning the potential for Arvida to put a retirement village on. So I touched on retirement village in my evidence in chief and talked about the traffic generation associated with that. I suppose in my rebuttal evidence, one of the main things I focus on is the concern that was raised by council with regards to the potential for additional traffic on the wider transport network. I suppose my feel is that with a retirement village development, that would lessen the potential for traffic on the wider network. I suppose retirees are more local, I would have anticipated, in their travel patterns. And it also provides the opportunity for employment through a retirement village. So again, some of what I talked about in my rebuttal evidence was the idea of, if this isn't a residential zone, there's potentially there's a loss of future jobs. Whereas I suppose with a retirement village, there are potential future jobs within the Lincoln catchment, again, reducing the wider network effects.
All right, no, thank you for that. Andrew, any questions?
Well, you've just covered off my question. Thank you for that.
Rowan and Malcolm?
Yes, I've been very concerned about the cumulative effects on the local network as well, and you have covered that off nicely. Thank you.
And Mr. Fuller, no questions from me. As you said, as you summarise, the key point I take from your evidence is that should we be minded to consider the request for rezoning favourably, it has a net reduction in the load on the wider traffic network. So
That's correct.
So that was kind of pretty much full stop as far as I was concerned. Thank you.
Right, we might, which one, Elliot and Gareth, which one would you like to go first?
I'll go first, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'll just wait for Lisa to hand out your summary. Can you hand that
Yep.
to me? Now, I had filed a memorandum. There were two reports from Dovis Ogilvy attached to Mr. McLaughlin's evidence, which said that the authors of those reports would be available for questions. So what's being handed out is just a summary of the report, and then you can ask any questions. So Elliot, I'll just get you to read your summary.
Probably heavy at the introduction there in terms of saying that I'm a civil or chartered civil engineer and an engineering director at Stillwater Partners.
Yep, sorry, I might just, sorry to be rudely interject. You can start at your para 9 if you're happy with
Thank you.
that.
I was
Yep.
gonna skip through the other points, so that was all right. So I was involved in the preparation of the geotechnical D study and the servicing overview, which was the engineering servicing report. If we jump to the servicing aspects there with regard to water being the first point, the high pressure water network has been designed based on commercial land use. So when we did the original Verdeco development, we considered this block as part of the overall design. The high pressure water can be supplied by the existing network located in the Verdeco development to the north and west of the site and to an extension of Springs Road network. The overall Verdeco water supply takes into account the Selwyn District Council Water Activity Management Plan and the Lincoln Master Plan. There's a 200mm water main down Springs Road and a 150mm main into Verdeco. This is a loop main around the Verdeco Park development. Conceptual water servicing would include an extension of the 150mm main from the stage 6 boundary and also from the stage 3 boundary there, and an extension of the 200mm main down Springs Road to the development area. The original modelling was based on commercial development, as I've previously said, with a demand of 11 litres a second. So this is enough to service at least 110 residential lots for high pressure water. The water supply would be designed for firefighting supply and adequate pressures as outlined in the Code of Practice there at Selwyn District Council and the relevant New Zealand standards there, which is the firefighting standard. And I can probably just add to that the firefighting demands for commercial land are much higher than residential demands. So effectively twice the demand for commercial. So the pipes were put in place are much bigger than you'd typically put in for residential land use. So I think there's probably a additional capacity if it was to revert to residential land use. With regard to sewer, the servicing for the development has been designed based on commercial land use. The pump station has been constructed to service the Verdeco residential and rural residential development. I note that the pump station is actually adjacent to the site we're talking about, and it sits between the site and the stormwater management area that's been built. The pump station was sized for 8.3 hectares of commercial land with a peak flow of about 8.3 litres a second. So this is equivalent to the maximum flow generated from approximately 240 residential lots. So the pump station has sufficient capacity for residential development on the site. The network to service the lots would be designed in accordance with the Selwyn District Council Code of Practice. With regard to stormwater, stormwater could be managed for quantity and quality requirements within the development area. A stormwater treatment and storage area would need to be provided to discharge to the western boundary drain via a swale constructed to service Verdeco. So that swale has been constructed as part of the, I think, stage 3 and 4 of Verdeco. The site falls within the L2 river catchment. In order to mitigate water quantity effects, any stormwater discharge to the western drain would need to be attenuated to pre-developed flows for storms up to and including the 2% AEP or annual exceedance probability critical duration event. In order to mitigate water quality effects, stormwater would be treated via a treatment train prior to discharge to the drain. Conceptual stormwater management plan would include reticulated stormwater systems with sumps to remove pollutants, discharge to a first flush basin for treatment, and discharge to a detention basin for further treatment. Discharge to ground where appropriate soil conditions allow. So we have a combination of all of these three in the current Verdeco development and the adjacent stormwater management area. There'll be limited discharge to the western boundary drain, and secondary flow paths will need to be provided. Test pits and infiltration testing were undertaken on site during the design phase of Verdeco Park, and they indicated infiltration rates in the order of 180 to 310 millimetres an hour. Consent from Environment Canterbury would be required for the operational and construction phase stormwater discharge. The stormwater system would be designed as specified in the Code of Practice and other relevant consents. And by that, I think we're talking about the global consent that's been covered for the Lincoln area. To go to other services, both the Orion Power Network and Enable Telecommunications networks are installed within the adjacent Verdeco development. The networks could be extended from the existing development to service the development area, but this is yet to be confirmed. So we tend to get the power and telecommunications work designed following the scheme plan being done, the layout being designed, obviously working with Avita, that depth of that is not normally a constraint at all. If we shift to the geotechnical side of things, we carried out a geotechnical review of the undeveloped area on the southeast corner of Verdeco Park, and we provided a report which was in Appendix J that's referenced. Based on the expected ground conditions from the limited testing on site and nearby, as well as the low risk of natural hazards, we consider the site as suitable for residential development. Any application for plan change or subdivision will require additional geotechnical investigation to satisfy the testing requirements outlined by the MBIE guideline for residential subdivisions in Canterbury. You'll need to be a more detailed consideration of natural hazards as required by Section 106 of the RMA. But we note the following considerations in regard to residential development. From the information available and knowledge of the area, it is likely that ultimate bearing capacities will be in the order of 200 to 300 kPa. So that's on the cusp of good ground. Subject to further investigation, would expect residential development in the area to adopt standard 3604 foundations. So that's the timber frame building standard foundations, or waffle slab type foundations. In TC2 areas would again expect waffle slabs to be constructed. These will need to be specifically engineer designed. And probably as a background, the vast majority of the existing Verdeco subdivision is TC1, so a very low liquefaction risk. There is a very thin strip with coarser grained sandy soil, so there's half a dozen lots affected by TC2 categorization within Verdeco Park. The site is mapped by Selwyn District Council with the potential for inundation. I think this is in a 1 in 200 year event. Future residential land development will be designed to address the inundation hazard. It is recommended that site levels are confirmed by a registered professional surveyor and minimum floor levels are established in consultation with Selwyn District Council and Environment Canterbury. It is likely that there will be a requirement for geotechnical investigations of each lot at building consent stage. to ensure that potential site-specific geotechnical issues are appropriately addressed.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Duke, I'll see if we have questions for you, Andrew.
Thank you for that. Just a commentary. So looking at para 12, you talked about the demand being equivalent to 110 residential lots.
Yep.
Yep. And I think I've just looked up Mr. McLaughlin's evidence, and I understand the proposal, if it's zoned general residential, would have about 100 households.
Yep.
So I'm just interested, are there any implications if it was a retirement village, for instance, or a higher density was developed on that site? If you can have 100 households anywhere under the general residential zone provisions, and you're saying that it's equivalent to 110 lots, is there any issue if it was higher density?
No, well, the pipe networks have, as I said, is a bit oversized because we designed the pipe networks for peak flows, which in this case is firefighting demand. We just need to work through with Selwyn District Council the average demands, but I wouldn't have thought it'd be significant. And there's not much of a difference typically between standard residential development and retirement villages. While there might be smaller or a larger number of units, are smaller in size and smaller in terms of average occupancy numbers.
Sure.
So you might have 1.5 people on average living in a retirement village when you might have closer to 3 in a typical residential setting.
Sure. No, thank you for clarifying that. No further questions.
Raymond?
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question to do with the stormwater. I believe there were some issues with stage 1 of Vertico Park's stormwater with some banking up and issues. Just want a reassurance that as that's upstream from
Yes.
this proposal, has that been taken into account with the stormwater planning for this?
Yeah, there were issues during the stage 1 construction because the western drain hadn't been constructed. So and at the time we had excavated out an infiltration system, but as the site was under construction, that silted up, so it reduced infiltration rates, and the secondary flow to the western drain hadn't been constructed, but that was built as part of stage 2 and 3, I think it might have been. So that is now primary outflow is to ground, secondary flow now goes out the western drain. So
Thank you. That's the reassurance of
no issues. Yeah. I'm aware of the issues at the time, that's for sure. Yeah.
And no further questions from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. This is Mr. Oddy, is that how I pronounce it? Gareth Oddy, who provided a report in relation to contamination and is now going to provide you with a summary of that report. And I assume it is acceptable for Mr. Oddy to start at paragraph 9 of his summary.
Yep, paragraph 9 is good. Thank you.
Good morning. So yeah, starting off with site investigations. So yeah, the first publicly available environmental assessment for the site was completed by PDP in December 2010. And that was a phase 1 environmental assessment of both 1486 and 1506 Springs Road. The PDP phase 1 report did not identify any former or current land uses on 1506 Springs Road, which were considered as potential sources of contamination. Prior to my direct involvement with Davis Ogilvy staff, completed a detailed site investigation at the Springs Road site, which included both 1486 and 1506 Springs Road. That was completed in August 2018. Yeah, there's numerous studies that have identified that urban residential soils where there is no hail, which is a hazardous activity or industrial land use. Yeah, that where hail hasn't been identified, there can still be elevated concentrations of several inorganic elements compared to background soil concentrations. So yeah, most residential sites built between the late 1950s and 1980s. Asbestos, copper, lead, arsenic and zinc are key contaminants of concern, principally derived from the leaching and weathering of building materials used in the construction of dwellings. So the DSI in 2018 included the collection of 5 shallow soil samples from predominantly around the residential property and the chicken run at 1506 Springs Road to target typical urban contaminants. Soil samples were screened with a handheld XRF to evaluate potential heavy metal concentrations. The concentrations of the contaminants of potential concern, including arsenic, copper, lead, and zinc, were identified in soil at concentrations above background, but generally below NES residential soil contamination standards. Following the identification of land contamination, a remedial action plan was also produced by Davis Ogilvy initially in January 2019. The RAP, being a live document, was then revised in May 2019 and again in October 2020 to reflect slight changes in the remedial methodology. Remedial works have largely been completed at 1486 Springs Road and yet to commence at 1506 Springs Road. During the development of 1486 Springs Road, surplus soil has been stockpiled at 1506 Springs Road, 1506 Springs Road, and some geotechnically unsuitable material has also been placed and capped within the site. The geotechnically unsuitable material, which contains contaminants of potential concern above background but below residential standards, is also understood to be potentially removed from by the new owners in the future. Under my direction, field staff completed waste characterization sampling of the stockpiles to determine the most cost-effective and beneficial reuse of the soil. Representative samples of the stockpile were collected and submitted for laboratory analysis for heavy metals, including arsenic, cadmium, copper, chromium, lead, mercury, nickel, and zinc, and also asbestos. Also under my direction, a targeted DSI was completed around the residential property in January 2023. The report is currently being compiled. This DSI was to inform remedial works for the shallow contamination identified during the previous Davis Ogilvy 2018 DSI. All of these investigations were carried out in accordance with the Ministry for the Environment Contaminated Land Management Guidelines. So yeah, it is my understanding that the surplus soil stockpiles containing predominantly topsoil and subsoil with concentrations of contaminants at or above background will be disposed of off-site to a licensed disposal facility. Further, based on elevated heavy metal concentrations identified around the former residence, remediation is to be completed to ensure that the land meets residential 10% produce standards. Following the soil and stockpile removal work, the underlying soil to remain will be validated to confirm it meets the required residential standard. The contaminated soil stockpile material will be removed from the site as part of bulk earthworks left to complete. On this basis, it is my opinion that from a ground contamination perspective, the site is suitable for the proposed residential land use. I conclude that there is no contaminated land issue that would preclude the granting of consent for the rezoning of that land at 1506 Springs Road on the basis of the conditions discussed in this evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Ari. I'll see if we have questions for you, Andrew. No?
At your paragraph 13, you talk about weathering of building materials, leaching, copper, lead, arsenic. Is that because that's the way that timber's been treated?
Yeah, yes, correct. So treated timber used in contact with the ground, so piles and other external facing timber is treated with copper, chromium, and arsenic. So you often find that around residential buildings, and lead also from lead-based paints used prior to the 1980s.
Do they use today in this day and age? Is there any products that don't leach toxins?
Not currently in New Zealand.
No.
We still treat our timber with CCA, copper, chromium, arsenic. Yeah.
Thank you. No questions.
And Malcolm? And just out of interest, in terms of the proposed development for the site, say assuming a retirement village, would any soil above background levels or potentially above residential standards be excavated across the whole site, or would that be confined to areas where there's not going to be hard stand put in, so like under roads or parking or hard stand areas, or would it be the whole site or just parts of it?
Yeah, typically for geotechnical reasons, most of the topsoil is removed. So yeah, the majority of it will be scraped.
Yeah.
For the top 200-300 normally.
Right, thank you for clarifying that. No further questions.
Thanks.
Thank you. Now, if the technology is with us, we should have Mr. Ballingall.
Yeah,
JB.
JB probably.
Yeah. Hello, John, can you hear us?
I can indeed. Good morning.
Thank you. So just to introduce John Ballingall. He has a summary which Lucy is just handing out. We're also conscious that you have heard some evidence at a hearing earlier in the week on another rezoning and heard some economic evidence from Mr. Thompson. So we have alerted Mr. Ballingall to that evidence that was given previously in the week and expect there may be some questions from him, to him in relation to that evidence that was given, but we have attempted to cover that in the summary to head it off in any event.
And that's very good, thank you. So good morning, Mr. Ballingall. If you're happy just to start reading your summary from your paragraph 5, that would be great, thanks.
Certainly. In my original economic assessment, attached to the evidence of Mr. McLaughlin on 5 August 2022 and rebuttal evidence of 3 February 2023, I concluded that industrial land in the Selwyn district is oversupplied relative to projected demand using a range of demand and supply estimates out to 2051. Plan-enabled residential land in the district is materially undersupplied relative to demand in the medium to long term. Demand is being driven by higher than originally projected population growth. In my view, district-wide economic efficiency will be enhanced by making more of the relatively scarcer resource, residential zone land, available. This would also improve housing affordability by expanding supply. As such, I support the rezoning of 1506 Spring Roads from general industrial zone to general residential zone. I have seen no evidence that disagrees with my conclusion regarding residential land in the district. There is a clear need for more housing at a district level. Mr. Thompson focuses on Lincoln rather than the district, but also concludes there is current capacity for 5.1 to 5.2 years of demand, which is insufficient for a competitive housing market and does not meet the requirements of the NPS-UD. So we agree there is an urgent need for more residential zone land in Lincoln, which is my key argument. There is less agreement on the level, nature, and optimal location of industrial land demand relative to industrial land supply. My estimates, drawing on publicly available sources for industrial land supply and my own demand projections, suggest there is very little risk of industrial land becoming scarce at the district level. There is ample industrial land supply to meet projected industrial demand at the district level, with the majority of supply being in Rolleston. Mr. Thompson and I differ markedly in our beliefs about where projected industrial demand at the district level might best locate. Mr. Thompson's view is that the expected strong population growth in Lincoln necessitates significant amounts of supporting industrial activity in Lincoln itself. He notes around 50% of industrial land demand occurs at the local level and is therefore most efficiently provided at the local level. Based on this view, he concludes that there would be significant economic benefits from rezoning land at 1137 and 1153 Springs Road from general rural zone to either a mix of general industrial zone and a residential zone, his option A, or general industrial zone alone, his option B. I disagree with Mr. Thompson that around half of industrial activities are most efficiently provided at the local level. As I state in my rebuttal evidence at paragraph 37, regional or district population growth is likely to drive a regional or district demand for industrial land. But precisely where this demand occurs within the district or region is unlikely to be determined by population alone. Industrial businesses will consider a wide range of factors when deciding where to locate. Easy access to customers is important, of course, but so too are access to suppliers, workers, and logistics networks. All of these factors reduce business costs and promote agglomeration benefits. And all of these factors are more prominent in Rolleston than in Lincoln. In my view, this explains why 55% of industrial jobs created in the Selwyn district between 2016 and 2020 occurred in Rolleston, compared to just 7% in Lincoln. And total employment in Rolleston grew by 77% between 2016 and 2022, compared to just 2% in Lincoln. It is clear that industrial businesses are voting with their feet and choosing to operate in Rolleston rather than alternative locations such as Lincoln. Excuse me. They are assessing that while Lincoln may be experiencing strong population growth that creates extra demand for their goods and services, so too is the already larger and even faster growing Rolleston. They are concluding that if there is particularly strong demand from Lincoln for their goods and services, Lincoln residents will probably be prepared to make a 10-minute drive to Rolleston. And if Lincoln residents decide they don't want to drive that far, then there's still the ample and rapidly growing population of Rolleston to service. And they are judging that Rolleston offers more agglomeration benefits than Lincoln that might better support their business goals. As such, I struggle to understand how Mr. Thompson can conclude that many firms would prefer to locate in Lincoln if there was industrial land available. He presents no source to support this statement, and there has been, as far as I'm aware, no surge in requests to rezone existing Lincoln land to industrial, which might have been expected if such a powerful latent demand for industrial land in Lincoln existed. To put it another way, just because Lincoln has experienced population growth doesn't mean that those people all stay in Lincoln every day and demand industrial firms' goods and services. In fact, the Lincoln population is highly mobile because labour markets are not defined at a very local level. People usually work in different locations to where they live. Data from Waka Kotahi NZTA indicates that 831 people live and work in Lincoln, 726 people travel into Lincoln for work, and 1,287 people leave Lincoln for work, primarily travelling to work in Christchurch City. Mr. Thompson suggests that Mr. Ballingall and I are therefore in agreement that the existing industrial centre in Lincoln is poorly located and the proposed industrial centre is optimally located, and that by implication, the optimal economic outcome is to relocate the industrial node from the existing to the proposed location. This is a leap of logic. It is true that I state the northern site is overall superior to 1506 Springs Road for industrial activity in Lincoln, but I maintain that Rolleston is a far more attractive location for industrial activity at the district level. That is, if a Selwyn district-based industrial firm's location choice is just between 1506 Springs Road and the northern site, it would probably prefer the latter. But that simply isn't the choice they face. They can choose Rolleston as well. Nothing is forcing them to locate in Lincoln. This is not a theoretical approach to firm location choices, as Mr. Thompson asserts. It's simply a real world assessment. So in my view, the optimal economic outcome for the district would be for industrial firms to locate in Rolleston, not Lincoln, and rezoning more land in the district for residential purposes in order to address the clear and critical housing shortage. As such, I confirm the conclusion in my original assessment that district-wide economic efficiency will be enhanced by making more of the relatively scarcer resource, residential zone land, available. Therefore, I support the rezoning of 1506 Springs Road from general industrial zone to general residential zone.
Thank you, Mr. Ballingall. I'll see if we have questions for you, Andrew.
Yes, thank you for your evidence, and thank you also for anticipating where our questions might be if we had any. That's very helpful for me, for you to examine, I guess, the commentary that Mr. Thompson has made in your response to that. Thank you. I do have a question. So are there any types of industrial activities that are more likely to service a local market?
Yeah, you would think perhaps well, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Foy both note in their evidence that things like car servicing, cafes, that sort of thing might be more likely to reside closer to population centres or local population centres. But my understanding is that in Lincoln, most of those activities are already permitted in the town centre zone. So I'm not sure there'd be a huge surge of industrial activity over and above what's already there.
Sure, and I understand the commentary you make around the choices that industrial activities might choose to make in terms of location. But is there a benefit to the local community in having closer services?
If we're talking just about Lincoln?
Yes, Lincoln and industrial services.
Well, I mean, as always, and here comes the first economist's cliche, there are trade-offs. Yes, of course, it's nice to have industrial activity, close to a population base. But you've got to think about what the counterfactual might be. It's not that the land would otherwise be unused. For this rezoning application, we're talking about building a bunch of houses, which is desperately needed in the Selwyn district. So there's an economic benefit with that. There could also be an economic benefit with industrial activity. But in my view, there's no shortage of industrial land in Selwyn. And industrial activity can go somewhere else. It can go 10 minutes away to Rolleston. And I don't think you're going to experience a huge loss of economic benefits in Lincoln. But what you do get is a contribution to improving the housing supply and improving affordability. So it's really not enough to say there are benefits from having industrial activity in Lincoln, because you can say there are benefits from having any type of activity in Lincoln. It's about which activity delivers the greatest well-being benefits to the community. And in my opinion, based on the relative scarcity of land, the greatest benefits would come from rezoning this land to residential activity.
So if there, I guess just theoretically, if there wasn't a residential land supply shortage, which you referred to, do you think there's advantage or benefit in having industrial land in Lincoln? Because you've said basically in terms of trade-off, there is greater benefit. If we change that equation and provided extra residential, do you see that there could be value in having local industrial land in Lincoln then to service those local markets?
Yeah, that changes the trade-off, absolutely. So I mean, again, this isn't really a binary issue. It's not necessarily either or, it's the balance of land apportioned between those two activities. I accept that there would be, if there wasn't a housing shortage, and there wasn't huge demand for housing land in Selwyn, then yes, the land might usefully be used for industrial activities. Yeah, I mean, in those circumstances, industrial activities could deliver a benefit for the local community. But as I say, all the evidence that I've seen and my own evidence points to the fact that industrial firms don't want to locate in Lincoln, at least not that many compared to Rolleston. Rolleston's just got more attractive features for industrial activities firms, namely a larger population base, better access to transport networks, and agglomeration benefits of having a bunch of other firms around you who you can work with.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Yes, in your paragraph 15, and it's probably just touching on what you were talking to Commissioner Willis about. You talk about a wider range of factors that determine where industrial businesses locate. And you've talked about population, easy access to customers and suppliers. Are there any other factors?
Well, those, yeah, to my mind, those are the main ones: access to customers, supplying industries, transport networks, and workers, because those are all things that determine the costs of business, costs of doing business. If you've got more workers close by who can come and work for you, that improves your chance of getting good workers. You know, if you're close to a larger population base, that's likely to improve demand. If you're close to logistics networks, that reduces your transport costs. So all of these things will feed into business decision making. And effectively what they do is reduce the overall costs of doing business, which improves profitability, improves productivity. And if these firms are improving their productivity by being in Rolleston rather than Lincoln, that allows the district to generate more economic benefits for a given set of resources, and that supports community well-being. So I think those are the key ones from my perspective, and it largely comes down to Rolleston would contribute to reducing business costs and improving business revenue.
Okay, great, thank you.
Malcolm?
Yes, thank you for the way in which you've laid this out. It's very good. I'm just noticing your comment on paragraph 22 that many firms would, Mr. Thompson concluded that many firms would prefer to locate in Lincoln if there was industrial land available. Just interesting to explore, if you know, Next Level Developments have owned this zone piece of industrial land for some time. Are you aware if they've been approached for any industrial uses on that over that time period they've owned it?
That isn't something that I've discussed with them, so no, I'm not aware of that.
Perhaps they'll be able to clear that up for us.
I can comment. We've had no approach from anyone looking to relocate any business or start anything new in the area that we're talking about over since Garrison Developments took it over in 2018 or so. Yeah, so no approaches.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Mr. Bannicle, I'd just like to ask you some questions about your table 2 that's in your rebuttal evidence. It's on page 4.
Yep. Excuse me, I'll just get there.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just bear with me, I was writing something else down. I just want to be clear, I understand the table. So marginal demand, can you explain that in lay terms, what that means?
Yeah, sorry about that. Bit of jargon. All we're saying there, the marginal demand is the additional demand over and above what's already occurring. So yeah, a good chunk of industrial land is already occupied. The marginal demand is just the extra demand that we think is going to happen out to 2051 based on there being a much larger population in the district, which is going to generate more demand for industrial activities.
Can I just ask one question of clarification there to give the Commissioner some updated information? Have you assumed that the land at Rolleston, subject to PC 80 in your numbers, is industrial?
That's correct. I've assumed it's vacant industrial land. So,
Yeah.
so these
So-
numbers would, sorry, yes.
So I'm not sure if the commissioners are aware, but the decision on that has just been released. So 98 hectares at Rolleston. I'll give you a copy of the decision. Commissioner Corbell's just released a decision granting that
Okay, that's
rezoning.
interesting.
It's an interesting decision for a number of reasons because it's quite different to the position Commissioner Thomas took. But I'll give you copies of it. It also includes some HPL land, so that might be interesting for you as well as to how the Commissioner has dealt with that. That's 98 hectares at Rolleston. We're obviously still on an appeal period, but we'll wait and see what happens.
That'd be interesting to receive that. Thanks. Perhaps if you could liaise with the council, if they have a copy, they could give it to us digitally.
Yeah, I've got hard and we can organise. I've got hard copies here, but we'll.
Digital will be good for me.
Yeah.
Think. Yeah, and I noticed, Mr. Bagnall, his footnote 3 said he includes change 80 to 98 hectares in his assumptions. So the 44 to 47 marginal demand, so that's over the indicated time periods, 2022 out to 2031 and 2051. Collection, Mr. Thompson, I think he came up with an annual marginal demand, to use the same terminology, of 23 hectares per annum.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, so you're fundamentally different positions on that.
Yeah, it's it's not entirely clear how he's coming up with such big numbers. I mean, I think his assumptions was based on assumptions around square meters per worker, which just seemed very, very high to me. There are a series of alternative demand forecasts floating around in the various pieces of evidence I've read from Mr. Foy and Ms. Hampson, but these are not publicly available, so I can't comment on them. So all I can say is that our projection methodology for demand for industrial land is consistent with what was done in 2018 by the district council. The methodology is almost identical, and our numbers aren't hugely different to theirs. So I think it's rational. I think it's sensible, and I'm very comfortable with the range that we've presented. So if there are new versions floating around with much higher numbers, I'll be very interested to have a look at them, because from my numbers, it just doesn't seem that there's any chance of there being a shortage of industrial land in Selwyn over the next 25 years, 30 years.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just again, the differences between the supply operative plan row being 354 and supply proposed plan being 323. Can you just explain the difference there?
I just have to go back to my methodology there. I did this so long ago. Sorry, I would need to go back to my original assessment and check that there. I think it's just taken into account changes.
That's all right.
Can I get back to you on that one rather than?
And so if you can just relay that answer through to Ms. Appleyard, and she'll relay it through to the hearing secretary, who'll give it to us. That's fine.
Yes. Yep. Apologies. I'll get back to you very shortly.
No, that's fine. And other than that, no further questions, but thank you very much for your evidence.
Thank you.
Mr. McLaughlin.
Morning.
Morning. Do you want me to start anywhere particular, or if you could, because my rebuttal evidence I can take as read?
Yes, we thank you for the pre-circulated evidence, which we have read. We can take that as read, but of course, as with other witnesses, you're very welcome to highlight key points, or we can go straight to questions, but that's up to you.
Look, I think I've explained it enough through the original chief evidence and the rebuttal evidence. I'm happy to take questions first if you're okay with that.
Yep, that's fine. Andrew.
I am just checking through your two statements of evidence. And I have no questions for you. Thank you.
Thanks.
And nor do I, but thank you very much for your evidence.
Excellent, thank you.
All that means is that we understood the evidence and there's no issues that we need to clarify with you. So that's all good. Thank you. So, Ms. Appiah, what I might suggest we do now is take, unless you want to do anything by way of summing up.
No, I don't need to do so. I'll give you the PC80 decision. So I was just going to have a little talk to you about batting order and what we're going to do next.
Yeah.
Unless you've got anything else you want to.
No, so we'll adjourn the formal part of the hearing now for a morning tea, and then we can have a discussion offline about process for the rest of the day.
Thank you.
How long was it? Half an hour?
15 minutes.
Well, good morning, everyone. We'll resume the hearing of hearing 30.4 rezoning requests for Lincoln. And at this stage, we're hearing from what we refer to as the Carter Group. So Zap, we are over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for your efficiency this morning. So the only witness that we have a constraint with is Mr. Jones, who's currently conducting some auctions, but he's going to be available at 10:45. So I thought I might deal with any questions you have on legal submissions between now and then. And then we'll hear from Mr. Sellers and Mr. Mathamo and Mr. Phillips.
Right, that sounds very good. So in terms of the legal submissions, are there any points you'd like to highlight for us?
The only particularly different matter that arises in these legal submissions that hasn't arisen in the others that I have given is in relation to this particular piece of land and the position regarding MPS HPL. I don't know if there's any questions on that, but I have set out in these legal submissions why, for a number of reasons, this land is caught by the exemption in the MPS MPS HPL, and isn't to be regarded as highly productive land for the purposes of that document. That is not to say that there aren't highly productive soils on this land and we need to deal with those in any event, but the relevance of the document, we say, is it doesn't apply to this particular piece of land.
Yeah, and in that regard, because under variation 1, the council initiated variation, it's been zoned MRZ without immediate legal effect, but nevertheless it's been indicated for urban use. In my mind, that exempts it from the MPS.
Yes, and that's the argument
Okay.
in a nutshell.
Okay.
The other point is this tortuous interface between this process and the variation process. This piece of land is obviously different because it is included in the variation at the initiative of council, which is different to all the other parties I've represented where we are lodging Me Too submissions. And I've highlighted to you before that I've got some anxiety around scope. This one is clearly within the variation. Notwithstanding that, the question might be asked, well, given it's clearly within the variation, why are you bothering to come to this hearing? We'll deal with the whole lot then. There's a difference between a council initiated process and relying on the evidence that council wishes to bring to that hearing to support the inclusion of the land as a new residential zone. They could decide to withdraw that from the variation, and the case that I want to run for my clients supporting rural to rezoning, which I think is at a higher level of quality. I've got no idea what evidence the council are going to bring to support that new residential zone, and I don't want to take a punt and relying on that. So that's the short explanation. It may involve some duplication and some costs from my client, but that's a cost they're prepared to bear. So I think we're entitled to be in 2 processes for this piece of land.
Yeah, and certainly probably echoing what I said earlier this morning with regard to our next level. So as far as this panel is concerned, we will in our decision indicate whether based on the evidence before us, we consider that a rezoning to residential is appropriate or not. And then we'll need to see what the independent hearing panel come up with regarding medium density zoning over that same block of land. And of course, we already have plan change 69 underlying the whole area as well. So
yeah,
but certainly we'll be making a finding on the, I guess, an in principle finding on rezoning.
Is this suitable for residential rezoning, regardless of the intensity?
Exactly. So we'll be making a finding on that in our decision as a PDP hearings panel.
Thank you.
Now to see if sorry, anything else you'd like to add at this stage?
No, that's enough for me.
Okay, I'll see if we do have questions from the legal submissions, Andrew.
Just the one. Thank you for your legal submission. I found it very clear. Paragraph 52.2, and you refer to the council adopting the commissioner's recommendation to approve PC 69. I'm just interested. So what were the options open to the council in response to that recommendation, and were there any constraints on their decision making?
Well, there was no constraints on their decision making. They had Mr. Rogers there giving them. I think Mr. Lyle might have been, Commissioner Lyle might have been there. I'm not sure. As far as I'm aware, there's no constraints on their decision making. There might be practical constraints, but there's certainly not legal
There's no legal constraint.
constraint. No.
So it's basically they can accept it or not accept it.
Yes. Yes.
And if it was not accepted, what's the process from that point?
Uh,
Appeals or-
Well, if it wasn't accepted, we would, it's still a decision of the council, so we would have been on appeal.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think you're clarifying that. No further questions.
Malcolm? And I don't have any questions of clarification either, but thank you very much for the legal submissions. They helpfully set out quite a lot of helpful background material.
Oh, the only, sorry, the only other point that I should make, and it's just because I haven't been here earlier this week, was the position of the city council in relation to this particular piece of land. I saw that Mr. Lightbody was down to appear earlier in the week, and I'm not sure whether he did or not. His evidence is general in relation to land which falls outside the boundary. But in relation to this particular piece of land, they were a submitter on PC 69. They did not appeal PC 69 and nor have they joined the appeal. And they actually are supporting the council's inclusion of the land as a new residential zone in the variation. So I would have actually liked that question to have been, I understand his argument in a generality, but on this relation to this particular piece of land, I am drawing dots together and assuming that they don't oppose.
We're not sure because Christchurch City Council elected late in the piece not to appear at the hearing. Just 42A team, I'm aware from, and my memory is failing me, but there's been a lot of information floating around. Did Christchurch City Council withdraw their submissions on any of the rezoning requests? Right. No, so all of their submissions are as per originally lodged, submissions and further submissions. But they elected not to attend this hearing.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's okay. Did they, you may not know off the top of your head, did they submit on variation 1 in terms of this block of land?
Yes, they did. Do you want to answer that, Justine? Sorry.
Yeah,
So they have supported the council's inclusion of it as a
Supported.
new residential zone, and in relation to part B of the variation, which further intensifies PC 69, because PC 69 and part B has been changed to the change. They have supported that as well.
right, no, thank you for that. Do you have a witness ready? We can, or would you rather wait? No, we can have Mr. Jones is coming on. Yep. Okay.
It's the same waiting for the host to start this thing, so it's on that way. I'll try it. No, you're all right. You're on the no, but it's not you working for it. Okay, hold on, 2 seconds. So, yeah, the passcode I have is 14930. Make sure you're on the right, so. 865 1218 2633. One four 0930. From this, okay. Yeah, we're seeing it. See you very soon. Thanks.
Have you got me there now, team?
Yes. Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Right, good morning and welcome, Mr. Jones, and thank you for making yourself available to appear before us at short notice. We've received your evidence, and particularly your rebuttal evidence, so you don't need to read that out to us. Are you happy if we just proceed to questions?
Yes, please. Thank you.
All right, Andrew.
Yes, thank you for your evidence, Mr. Jones. So just at paragraph 6 in your rebuttal evidence, you talk about while there are finished residential sections for sale in Lincoln, these are limited in number. There is nothing available of any significant scale. So what is significant scale, just for clarity? What sort of numbers are you talking about there?
Yep. So there's no, what I mean by there is there's not 3 or 4 developments all with 30 or 40 sites for sale at the same time on the market. We handling one development where we've got around about 15 sites available. So whilst there's some sites there, it's not going to be big enough as things start to pick up again, and we're having the likes of building companies coming along and buying, often wanting to buy swathes of 5, 10, 15 or 20 sites at a time. And having had a look around the rest of the market for developments we're not handling, again, there's odds and sods and bits and pieces, but not anything of major scale.
Right, thank you for clarifying that. My second question, just in relation to your paragraph 16, and you talked about without residential zoning of more land in Lincoln, it's likely Lincoln will experience significant shortage of residential houses in the near future. And you talked about this is only now correcting itself. So why is it correcting itself? Is it due to greater land supply, or is it something else that's occurring that's correcting it?
My understanding is just because of the change in the market. 2020 and 2021, as we'll all know, there was huge demand. I would say we're going back to what I call a more ordinary market. But and I've just seen the first signs of that now. But basically, for the last year, there has been practically a pause on section demand. But that was as a result of everyone having bought so much the year before. So whilst we've seen a pause in the market, I'm already seeing signs that there's going to be good demand going ahead next year. And it wouldn't take long in what I'd call a normal market to mop up what is available in Lincoln. And I'm also thinking it's probably not this year or next year it's such a problem. It's going to be down the track again if there's not, further land rezoned for future subdivisions.
Right. So I guess I'm just interested in exploring that sort of supply demand equation then. So it's correcting itself now, but it's not because of increased supply. It's because of other factors.
Yeah, I guess the last year there has just been simply been a pause in the market. So we're all sitting around really waiting a wee bit to see what will happen. We are seeing, and there hasn't been an increased supply in the last year, by the way. I think if you look at the entire Canterbury market, probably the whole country, there's just been a absolute pause for this type of stock for the last 12 months. But that's going to be a small moment in time. And as I said, you were already starting to see those green shoots again of people wanting to buy and build houses. So I think the last year an absolute aberration in terms of the whole market just being on pause.
Sure. Okay.
But my point was, if we have ample supply, then the prices stay at a stable level, and we're already seeing prices have slipped back from where they were, but that was because there was a very limited amount of sites for sale in 2021 with unprecedented demand. And my point in my report is, if we allow that to happen again, they'll simply have to keep going up. So I think now is a good time to be able to free up some land down the track to avoid this sort of pinch point happening again in the future. And this is one way of doing that.
So did demand outstrip supply? And I think I expect I know the answer to this, but did demand outstrip supply in other parts of New Zealand as well, outside of the Lincoln market, in that same period of time?
I can only really talk for Canterbury. Certainly in Canterbury, yes.
Right, and is there a lack of zone land in those other parts of Canterbury then that contributed to that, or was again something else in the market going on?
No, absolutely. If we again look specifically at Selwyn, there just hasn't been enough available land. If there was, the prices wouldn't have gone through the roof because there would have been heaps of sections for sale. I mean, that the owners of this land, were very keen to get the land into sections because they knew they could sell them. So that is the lack of zoned land in all of Selwyn is one major reason why we saw such an escalation in values.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Yes, at your paragraph 12, you talk about distinct housing markets. And then in paragraph 13, you say people come to Lincoln for a particular type of living. Can you explain what that particular type of living is?
Yeah, good question. Lincoln's always had a slightly rural, villagey feel to it, and a lot of buyers like that. I would say quite a variety of homes, a lot of downsizing or retiring farmers or lifestylers wanting a decent sized section still. It's got a stunning view into the hills. A lot of the older customers we sell to are members of the local Tap Club or Lincoln Golf Club. So people come there because it does have a rural feel, and it's quite bizarre that there's very few buyers I deal with that are asking me what sections I have for sale in both Rolleston and Lincoln at the same time. It's often, it's usually one or other. So there's that rural feel. It's got everything they need, but it's not massive. And now Rolleston's a brilliant place, no question, but not everybody wants to live in a major town, whereas Lincoln has all the amenities they need, but it's sort of, still got that rural village feel to it.
So as far as Rolleston goes, is it more your first home buyers that go to Rolleston?
Often, I would say I wouldn't just say first home buyers, but I would say Lincoln is definitely more, in my experience, more of a second, third, fourth, fifth home type area, where perhaps they end up with when they've got younger kids, or at the other end when they often move from the city out to Lincoln to sort of retire once the kids have grown up and moved on, and they want that sort of community village feel. So I'd say that's one thing. But I would say Rolleston has traditionally been more of a first home buyer market, and that's been around a number of things, but around cost, value, section sizes, and those sorts of things. Access to working if they're working across the other side of the highway there. Whereas Lincoln seems to be a different feel altogether.
No, great. Thank you very much.
No problems. Thanks for the question.
Malcolm?
Yeah, just following on from that, the rural village feel that you've been expressing. What size do you think Lincoln will lose it?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that it's not just the size of it. I guess it's where it's positioned, and it's in terms of its proximity to the hills, and you drive from Christchurch, for example, to Lincoln, and you're driving through. There's a bit of a rural feel to it. You pop over to the Akaroa Highway and you're out to Akaroa or into the city. So yeah, that is a good question. I don't know how to put a number on that, but I don't feel that Lincoln will ever look like Rolleston, and that's not a negative thing at all. They're just completely different towns, and it sounds bizarre when they're only 10 minutes apart, but they've got a completely different feel. If you walk down the main street of one and down the main street of the other, they are just a different feel. We hear that feedback time and time again, and it's evidenced by the fact that our buyers aren't looking in either one or other. They're looking at looking at both. They're looking at either one or other.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Jones. It's been very helpful. No further questions from me.
Thank you. Yeah, I better go and sell some. Thank you.
So,
Bye-bye.
can you just remind me, I can't recall. So in terms of the area of land that we're dealing with at the moment, the PC 69 area, how many lots is that? 1,710 lots. Okay, no, thank you.
Sorry, you didn't get all that.
Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for the evidence which has been pre-circulated, including your rebuttal evidence. We have read that, but you're very welcome to highlight key points for us if you'd like to, or else if it suits you, we can go straight to questions. Up to you.
I'm happy to go straight to questions, sir.
Okay, Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your evidence, Mr. Sellers. Just paragraph 15, I just have a question for that. I'm interested to know, you've talked about the land market in Lincoln exhibited a dysfunctional market. There is virtually no supply of choice. This is your rebuttal evidence. No supply of choice with uncompetitive market practices being adopted by vendors, resulting in extreme price escalation.
Yes.
I'm just interested, how similar is that to elsewhere within Canterbury and New Zealand? Or is that quite specific to Lincoln?
No, it's not. I can't comment outside of Greater Christchurch, but yes, it's more specific to what we've seen is being Selwyn District, where we saw higher escalation in terms of section prices in Rolleston, Lincoln, Prebbleton, and to a lesser extent West Melton. Rolleston, we had prices in 2021 increased by, in the space of 12 months, 140%, which is exceptional. Lincoln 100%, and the same in Prebbleton. As a comparison, I think Hallsville, which I guess is the closest comparison in terms of geographic, in terms for Christchurch City, section prices rose by approximately 50 to 60%. So we saw exceptional price escalation in 2021 in those three, particularly those three townships, but to a lesser extent West Melton as well, and was purely on the back of supply and demand, lack of supply and exceptional demand.
Mm. So just interested in the uncompetitive market practices. So in your experience, that it's softened or drops away if there's more players in the market, or is there a sweet spot in terms of how many players in the market are required? Do you know?
That's a sweet spot, but I think there's got to be more than just one. And I think the more choice and the more competition amongst vendors is helpful to the market in terms of price stability. So what we had back in 2021, instead of the normal practice of a developer releasing a stage or stages to the market, and at the same time they were releasing small blocks of 10 or 15 lots and tendering them or auctioning them basically, rather than going to the market at set prices, because they knew that they could keep testing the market and getting higher and higher prices because the market was just paying it at that time.
Sure. Sure. And I guess if more land is rezoned, why would that not necessarily happen again in the future? Because isn't that just general good economic sense to take that approach?
Well, if there's competition, you can't, of course. If you've got another developer down the road releasing their sections in blocks, as is common practice, then you're not going to get away with it.
Okay. All right. No, thank you for that. You've answered my question.
And Malcolm? Sellers, just one query from me regarding, it comes from your paragraph 14. And you say there currently 32 lots are offered for sale. Oh, sorry, it's in your rebuttal evidence.
Yes.
Yeah. So that would have been at the time of writing this evidence. Those 32 lots, whereabouts, were they all in one place or were they scattered around
They're generally
township?
scattered around piecemeal, singular lots here and there. As Mr. Jones mentioned, there's a development of about 14 or 15 lots for sale.
Yeah.
But the rest are just piecemeal spread about the township.
Okay. And those 32 lots, they're all vacant lots?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. No, thank you very much. Just wanted to clarify that. No further questions.
Thank you.
If we had another question from me, forgive me, and if this is already in the evidence, in terms of the land that we're looking at today, the intended staging over time, can you remind me of the likely sort of pattern?
Yeah, the questions come up on a number of occasions. I think generally speaking, I think it's starting along Springs Road and going out. I think there's still a decision to be made as to whether it be east or west, but I think Springs Road being kind of the spine and key sort of exiting out of Lincoln and into this particular block, progressing outward from there. I think that decision is which direction goes.
And Mr. Phillips, just while you have the floor, in terms of then with the 1,710 lots, over what period of time might we see that whole number of lots released into the market? Do you know roughly?
No, I couldn't tell you. I'll be screaming around as to that's probably a question for Mr. Carter.
Yeah. Yeah, a written answer, just give us and forgive me, it's probably in the evidence somewhere, but just a rough time frame over which we might see that quite large area of land developed, that would be helpful. Yeah, that'd be great. I think a written answer would be better for that. Thank you. All right, so now we can have the next witness. So Mr. Farmer, good morning, welcome. Thank you for coming in at short notice.
Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you.
And as you've appeared for us a number of times, we've read your evidence, in particular your rebuttal evidence. Is there anything you'd like to highlight by way of key points, or are you happy to go to questions?
Nothing major other than the fact that the NPS kicked in October. But no, we can go into questions.
All right, thank you very much for that. I think Andrew, you might have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've just got two questions. Thank you for your evidence.
Thank you.
Again, this is the rebuttal evidence. So just looking at your paragraph 11.2a, and you've referred to moisture deficits and irrigation availability.
Yes. And
you said, while the site has irrigation consents, the consented volumes are not always sufficient to meet the crop demand. And I'm just interested, what is that like? Regularly, or is it all crops or some crops, or just occasionally, or only in times of drought? And how frequent or how bad is that situation where the consented volumes is not sufficient? Do you have any information on that?
So for this block, they've got groundwater tanks and access to river tanks or surface water tanks. The surface water tanks are subject to some strict conditions, subject to the flows in the creeks. And I don't have a frequency like 1 in 10 years or 1 in so many years, but they do certainly are restricted because of the quantities coming down. And with irrigation, reliability is a key factor. So if you go down, say, from 99% reliability to 96, 95, the impact on productivity is quite immense. Just that 1% or 2% drop, the impact can be quite significant.
Okay, no, thank you for that. That's very helpful. Just a sec. And my final question of two, just looking at your paragraph 12 and 12.1, and you've talked about the reduction in highly productive land as a result of the applicant's proposal as 0.015% and 0.09% respectively. And then you look at clause 3.10 of the MPS HPL, and you make a comment on that. I'm interested in your interpretation, your view on the clause that you've copied in there, clause B1, avoids any significant loss, and specifically the word cumulatively. How do you apply the word cumulatively when you're considering small one-off losses of highly productive land? If it was to occur in this block and another block and another block and another block, is that then cumulatively in your view?
So those numbers are specific to this block.
Yes.
But if you go to my evidence of August, 5 August 2022, I've got an appendix there that kind of tried to capture all the plan changes at the time.
Okay.
And so cumulatively across Prebleton or across Selwyn, of the plan changes that I'm aware of or were listed on the council website, cumulatively the percentage reduction is less than 1%. So across the whole district.
Okay, that's very helpful. So okay, I'll have a look at that. So in your evidence in chief, then you've actually looked at all the other plan changes and done an assessment. Okay,
that's correct. So I've got appendix 7 that lists all the plan changes that were on the go at the time.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
And any other land use applications that I was aware of. I do make the comment that it might not be all encompassing because there might be some information that I didn't have access to or I couldn't find. But the percentage cumulatively again would be around 1%. I'll be surprised even if we were to account for every other little plan change or land use proposal that I wasn't aware of. I'll still be surprised if it crept to 2%. It will still be closer to that 1% because the proposed rezonings, I think, contributed majorly to those potential reductions.
Sure. Okay. Yes. No, I have located that now. Thank you.
And obviously there is an update. PC 80, which is 18 hectares of LUC3, has now been approved. I know actually have evidence support of that.
Right, thank you for that. I appreciate you directing me to that piece of extra evidence in your evidence in chief. Thank you. No
Thank you.
questions.
Raymond? Malcolm?
No question.
And no questions from me either. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners.
Good morning.
Good morning.
By way of context, I provided a summary that was sort of hastily pulled together this morning.
that I can take you through on two particular matters.
Yeah, it's quite a short brief and we have plenty of time. So you're happy just to read it out, starting at para 4?
Yes, that's a good place to start. It's a para 4. Through the PC69 process, the original plan change request was amended to establish 3 areas of NCZ across the PC69 area, as opposed to 1 area of local centre zone was initially sought in its submission. The submitter for these proceedings seeks to provide for an equivalent outcome, obviously. The officer report and the commercial rezoning hearings doesn't contest the appropriateness of providing these commercial areas within the PC69 area, and nor were they contested through the PC69 proceedings. However, the officer report for the commercial rezoning hearings considers that rezoning 3 areas of NCZ is beyond the scope of the original submission on the proposed plan seeking 1 area of LCZ. Regardless of that issue of scope, they consider that the commercial development envisaged by any outline development plan should be provided for through the subdivision consent process and through the use of consent notices, given the flexibility this affords and the equivalent approach that's been utilised to date in the operative district plan. So for the purposes of this hearing, I just wish to note that I've prepared rebuttal evidence on this matter for the commercial rezoning hearings, which agrees with the officer's rationale. That's due to be filed tomorrow. In summary, that rebuttal evidence recommends amendments to sub-rec 3 with wording that's equivalent to rule 13.1 in the operative plan, in a way that would allow the establishment of commercial areas that are identified in ODPs to be worked through the subdivision consent process. Correspondence yesterday with the officer, I understand that's an approach that she will be supporting too, but she can talk to that. So noting the above, I consider that the Lincoln South rezoning request should rezone the entirety of the land GRZ, with the outline development plan being the mechanism for identifying the 3 areas of commercial land that are envisaged within the development area. And sub-rec 3 is amended, as I've described, providing the method for then establishing those commercial areas. In my view, that constitutes a change to the method of implementing the commercial areas envisaged for the Lincoln South rezoning rather than a substantive change to what is proposed. I'll just pause at that point too and note that reviewing the proposed amendments to the proposed plan in attachment 6 of my primary evidence, there's no change to the provisions per se or the wording in the ODP. It's the way it's worded that wouldn't need to change. So it's really in terms of how it would be reflected on the planning maps. And I'd also note from reviewing the original submission that was filed by Rolleston Industrial Developments on the proposed plan, it did make quite clear what zoning was sought, but it did go on to say that the purpose of that is to seek an outcome equivalent to PC69, and that may necessitate consequential changes. So that might be relevant in terms of that question of scope. Resuming at paragraph 8. PC80 is a private plan change that's initiated by Two Chain Road Limited to rezone a 98 hectare site in Rolleston, north of State Highway 1 from rural inner plains to Business 2A, which is an industrial zone. A report and recommendation by Hearing Commissioner David Coolball on PC80 was issued on Friday the 16th of February, and the report recommends that Council approve PC80. The purpose of bringing this recommendation to the attention of the panel for these proceedings is to distinguish key findings by Commissioner Coolball on the issues of demand and capacity, the timeframes for requiring additional capacity, and reliance on alternative planning processes to deliver that additional capacity. In this regard, my summary of evidence for the Rolleston rezoning hearings for the PDP addressed Commissioner Thomas's conclusions on these matters for PC 81 and 82. As to the key findings on PC80, Commissioner Coolball found there to be a risk that there is not sufficient development capacity at all times, and particularly in the long term. There is clearly significant demand for and limited supply of industrial land in Rolleston in particular. As to the most appropriate planning process for ensuring at least sufficient development capacity is provided for in response to that risk, Commissioner Coolball stated that in terms of leaving the land in its present zoning, that does have a potential benefit of enabling its rezoning to be more fully investigated through a more comprehensive assessment of the growth needs in Rolleston. In terms of rezoning through the district plan review process, as noted, the site is subject to the submission seeking a rezoning through that process, and the hearing is, I understand, scheduled. Given the timing of this hearing, the relative expedience of this process, i.e. through the rezoning through the operative plan, may not be significant, but that does not render this approach inappropriate. In relation to the future strategic review, that being the Greater Christchurch Partnership spatial planning process,
and the review of the CRPS. The request records an understanding that the CRPS will not be reviewed until 2024, and that even if the site is included in MAP A as part of that review, there will be considerable time delay in waiting for the review process to conclude, and further delay while the district plan was changed. So I note, closing, that the findings of Commissioner Caldwell as set out above align with the views that I expressed in my summary of evidence for the West of Duns Crossing Road rezoning request at the PDP Royston rezoning hearing, and in my rebuttal evidence for these proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you. I see if we have questions for you. Andrew, start with you again.
No questions. Thank you. Thank you for your evidence. Thanks.
And Malcolm.
Thank you for your evidence. No question.
Just one matter at your pair 11. I know you're just referring to Commissioner Caldwell's words rather than your own analysis. So given the evidence we heard this morning from Mr. Ballingall, potentially there might be a conflict there with Commissioner Caldwell saying there was a lack of industrial capacity. But of course, he was considering the situation in the absence of the Plan Change 80 being approved, whereas Mr. Ballingall had assumed that Plan Change 80 was in effect in existence. So while there might appear, there's not really a question, I'm just asking you to check this is my thinking is right. So while there might be an inconsistency there on its face, in reality, that's explained by the different ways they each had to consider Change 80 in front of them. Do you kind of follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. Not being familiar or not hearing, having heard the context this morning, I'm not overly familiar with that.
Or maybe Mr. Apple.
Commissioner Caldwell was having to make a decision on PC80. So, and Mr. Ballingall's evidence, he had assumed that PC80 had already been granted. So they're actually not inconsistent.
No, so that explains the difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Just if we were to, based on the evidence before us, find in favour of a residential zoning being appropriate for what I'll just call the PC 69 land, for want of a better description, the issues you raise at your para 7, to what extent would we need to address that matter in our decision, do you think?
Well, I don't think it's an issue of merit. It's, as I say, it's more about the method, and that's something that's going to get talked through, I guess, in more detail and through the evidence on the commercial rezoning hearings. In my rebuttal evidence for that, I've noted that that's an issue for any outline development plan that signals a commercial area, and I think the officers in their 42A report for the commercial rezoning hearings has raised the same point, that outline development plans by their nature are an outline, and that things can change and they're not locked down until a subdivision proposal appears, and you need to provide that flexibility. Otherwise you risk needing another plan change or having problems at the time you identify a site for commercial activity. So I think it's a pragmatic and sensible interpretation, and I can see the logic for that. There may be other methods for dealing with it. I think the fact that there is an existing method that's been tried and tested through the operative plan, I understand that that's worked, and council's obviously satisfied that that's worked. Otherwise, I wouldn't expect they'd be proposing that going forward. So, and that was the conclusion I'd reached in terms of the best way to deal with it, is you have a subdivision rule that provides for that consideration, or defaults to a discretionary process otherwise.
So just exploring that a bit further, again, if we were to find in favour of the, in principle, of the overall residential zoning of the land, would it be sufficient for us to say, in terms of this panel's decision, that the matter of the NCZ can be dealt with at a later stage through the subdivision process?
Yes, I think the matter before you is the appropriateness of identifying commercial areas as they've been referred to in the ODP, because that is part and parcel of this proposal and a well-functioning urban environment. So,
all right, no, thank you for that.
In connection with your question on the stage that you had answered.
Great. Yeah, that'd be very helpful if we can have the answer now. That'd be great.
It's a slightly hard question to answer because it depends on the market. But I also heard some of your questions directed about competition in the land markets. And one important thing to consider is there's various different phases in the land market. We are a subdivider. We buy bulk bits of land that we often end up selling to other developers. And then
or housing companies that then compete in a smaller number of lots. For example, with our plan change 73 in Rolleston, that was 2,000 odd lots or 2,100. We had a contract to sell 1,000 lots to Ngātahu to then do their subdivision alongside when we're doing our subdivision. So in answer to your question, how long will it take to develop 1,710 lots in Lincoln? It could take a year, because we might sell it to 1 or 2 developers who then do their own developments. If we developed it all out ourselves, I would imagine it would take somewhere between 4 to 8 years. Our plan with Rolleston and with Lincoln is to release 500 sections a year, and then that will be slowed down if the market's not there. We have a view that all the economic analysis is on the low side, because you look at Christchurch, we think Christchurch is a destination. Greater Christchurch is a destination now, is far more appealing relatively than it has been nationally. And we're seeing a lot of southern drift from Auckland, Wellington, and we think going forward that's going to pick up. And, you know, if there's a disaster, a cyclone, an earthquake, something that happens internationally, and New Zealand ends up picking up more international immigration, or if Greater Christchurch continues to accelerate in its national migration, which is what has been happening, we think the demand for new households in Greater Christchurch is going to be bigger than anyone's ever predicted so far. And that's a trend that has continued to happen repeatedly in Selwyn for the last 10 years. Nothing has been as high. The actual demand has not been predicted by any economist so far. It's always been far exceeding any predictions. We think that trend will just accelerate.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned 500 lots per year. Is that 500 lots per year across Rolleston and Lincoln, or is that each?
That's 500 lots per year in each link of Lincoln and Rolleston. And there's quite a bit of science to that. In terms of contractors being able to deliver sites, the most sort of efficient size for a contractor to deliver per annum in terms of putting services in the ground seems to be about 250 lots per site. So we would plan on having 2 contractors working in Lincoln and 2 contractors working in Selwyn, in Rolleston simultaneously.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. Just while you're here, I'll see if the panel has any questions I'd like to ask you since you're here. Andrew?
No, thank you for your statement. Nothing from me.
No. And Malcolm, anything? Mr. Carter?
No questions. Thank you, Mr. Carter, for tidying up those areas for us.
Great, thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Carter, for addressing that staging issue. No further questions from me.
Thank you. That's the end of our case. I think the next time we're back for commercial rezoning, so it won't see us for a wee while.
All right, well, thank you very much for that. That brings us to the end of today's public session of the hearing. So to the people present, enjoy the rest of your day. And if anyone's watching on YouTube, you enjoy the rest of your day as well. Thank you.
Yeah.